Let me tell you about something that happened to me a couple of years ago. It's one of those stories I don't talk about much, not because I don't want to, but because most people wouldn't believe it. I still have trouble wrapping my head around it, and I lived through it. It all started when my wife, Elena, and I decided to live off the grid. We wanted a simpler life, away from the noise and stress of the city. So, we bought a small cabin up in the mountains, miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by nothing but trees and sky. We had everything set up: a well for water, a wood stove for heat, and solar panels for electricity. It wasn't luxurious, but it was enough. The isolation was peaceful, until it wasn't. One night, about a year into living there, something happened that still gives me chills. It was early spring, and the days were getting longer, but the nights were still bitter cold. Elena had gone to visit her sister in the city, so I was alone in the cabin. It was a quiet night, no wind, no sounds from the forest, just silence. I was reading by the fireplace when the lights flickered. At first, I didn't think much of it. Our solar system had glitches sometimes, especially after a cloudy day. But it wasn't cloudy that day. A few seconds later, the lights went out completely. The cabin was pitch black, except for the glow of the dying fire. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside to check the inverter. The air was freezing, and the snow crunched under my boots as I walked around the side of the cabin. The inverter was in a small shed a few feet away. When I opened the shed door, I expected to see the usual, maybe a blown fuse or a tripped breaker. But everything looked fine. The batteries were fully charged, no reason for the power to be out. I decided to check the solar panels. They were mounted on the roof, so I climbed up the ladder we kept at the back of the cabin. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Normally, you'd hear owls or the rustling of branches. But that night, nothing. Just silence. The panels looked fine at first. No damage, no snow covering them. But when I leaned in closer, I saw something strange. The wires had been cut, not frayed or chewed, but cleanly sliced, like someone had taken a knife to them. I felt a knot form in my stomach. We were miles from anyone. Who would come all the way out here to cut our solar wires? And why? I started to climb down when I heard it, the sound of heavy footsteps on the roof. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving toward me. I shined my flashlight around, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Who's there?" No response. Just the sound of those footsteps getting closer. I scrambled down the ladder and ran back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. My mind was racing. Was it an animal? A person? Something else entirely? I grabbed the rifle we kept by the door and stood by the window, watching the shadows outside. But nothing moved. Hours passed, and the silence became unbearable. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the footsteps were an echo or a trick of the wind. But deep down, I knew better. Around 3 a.m., the power suddenly came back on. The lights flickered to life, and the hum of the fridge returned. I felt a moment of relief, until I realized the solar wires were still cut. There was no way the power should have been working. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise, every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. When dawn finally broke, I went outside to inspect the roof again. The wires were still severed, but that wasn't the worst part. The panels themselves had been rearranged. They weren't broken, but they had been shifted into a strange pattern, one that made no sense. It was like someone, or something, wanted me to notice. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, but there were no footprints in the snow. Nothing to suggest anyone had been there. When Elena came back the next day, I told her what happened. She laughed it off, said I was probably just tired and imagining things. But I knew what I saw. We had the panels fixed, and everything went back to normal for a while. But every now and then, I still hear those footsteps. Always at night. Always when I'm alone. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was some prank, an animal, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. The forest out here isn't as empty as it seems. I still see her face. I still hear her laugh. Some nights, I wake up convinced I can hear her calling out for me, faint and distant, like a voice carried on the wind. It's been 3 years since Emma disappeared, and not a day passes that I don't relive that moment. The day our world stopped. Sarah and I wanted a simpler life. We craved peace, a life away from the endless noise of the city. The cabin was perfect, tucked deep in the woods, miles from anyone else, the kind of place where time slows down. We built our life there with Emma, our 4-year-old daughter, who loved every inch of that forest. That day was like any other. A warm, golden summer afternoon. The sky was a perfect blue, the kind of day that makes you believe nothing bad could ever happen. "I'm going to gather some firewood," I told Sarah. She nodded from the porch, a book in her hands. Emma was running barefoot in the grass, chasing butterflies. Her laughter echoed through the trees, bright and carefree. "Stay close, sweetheart," Sarah called out. Emma giggled and nodded, her curls bouncing as she darted after another butterfly. I walked into the woods, axe in hand, feeling the cool shade of the trees settle over me. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I found a good spot and started chopping wood, lost in the rhythm of the work. Then I heard Sarah scream. I dropped the axe and ran. My heart pounded, a cold dread gripping me. When I broke through the tree line, I saw Sarah standing in the yard, frozen in place. "She's gone," she whispered. Her voice was hollow, disbelieving. I just went inside for a glass of water. 10 seconds. When I came back, she was gone. We searched everywhere, calling her name until our throats were raw. Nothing. No sign of Emma. It was as if the forest had swallowed her whole. When the police arrived, they brought dogs and a search team. They combed through every inch of the woods. Hours later, one of the officers called us over. "We found footprints," he said. We followed him to a spot about 50 yards from the cabin. Tiny footprints, Emma's. They led deeper into the woods. But then they stopped. Just stopped. There were no signs of a struggle. No indication that someone had grabbed her. No drag marks. No animal tracks. Nothing. She just disappeared," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. One of the officers frowned. "It's like she was lifted straight off the ground." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. The search went on for weeks. They ruled out kidnapping. There were no signs of anyone else, no tire tracks, no strangers seen in the area. And wild animals. No, there was no blood, no torn clothing, nothing that made sense. The theories ranged from her wandering off and getting lost to something more sinister. But none of it explained the footprints, the way they just stopped. Sarah and I stayed at the cabin, hoping, praying for a miracle. But something changed after Emma vanished. The forest, once a place of peace, now felt hostile. The trees seemed darker, the air heavier. At night, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. Then, the whispers started. It began with Sarah. She'd wake me in the middle of the night, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard her," she'd say. "I heard Emma." I thought it was grief, a cruel trick of the mind. But then, one night, I heard it too. A soft, distant voice. "Daddy!" I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, calling her name. The forest was silent, but the voice lingered, just out of reach. I followed the sound into the woods, my heart racing. The air was cold, colder than it should have been. The beam of my flashlight flickered as if something was draining the batteries. And then the voice stopped. I was alone, surrounded by towering trees and an unbearable stillness. When I turned back toward the cabin, I saw them. Footprints. Tiny barefoot prints in the soft earth, leading deeper into the woods. But just like before, they stopped. Only this time, they stopped in front of an ancient, twisted tree. Its bark was blackened, gnarled, as if struck by lightning long ago. A faint, unnatural hum seemed to pulse from it, making the air vibrate. I backed away, my flashlight flickering again, and stumbled back to the cabin. We left soon after that. The cabin, the woods, everything. We couldn't stay. The memories, the whispers, they were too much. But even in the city, the whispers followed. Sarah tried to block them out, to pretend they weren't real. But I couldn't. I kept hearing Emma's voice, kept seeing her footprints in my dreams. One night, I woke up to find her favorite stuffed rabbit lying on the porch. It was dirty, weathered by time, but it was hers. Sarah swore she hadn't seen it since Emma disappeared. Neither had I. I checked the area, looking for tracks, but there was nothing, just the rabbit. I don't know what happened to Emma. I don't know if it was something human or something else entirely. All I know is that the woods took her. And sometimes, when the night is still and the air is cold, I hear her. Soft, distant, calling me. Daddy. Have you ever lived in a place that feels wrong? I mean, everything looks normal, but deep down, you know something isn't right. That's what it's been like for us on the farm. I didn't believe in anything weird before moving here. Now I'm not so sure. It started about a year ago. We bought the place because it was cheap. A big, isolated farm out in the countryside. Quiet, peaceful. Or so we thought. We were excited, you know? A fresh start. The kids loved the open space, and my wife, Maria, couldn't wait to start a garden. We had a small flock of sheep, chickens, and a couple of cows. Life was simple. Then, one of the sheep went missing. I remember the day clearly. It was late afternoon, and I was out in the fields checking the fences. Maria called me, her voice tense. "Have you seen Daisy?" Daisy was one of our oldest sheep, friendly. She always stayed close to the others. "No," I said, frowning. "She might have wandered off. I'll look." We searched for hours, checking every corner of the farm. Nothing. No tracks, no broken fences. Just gone. It didn't make sense. Sheep don't just disappear. We figured maybe she got out somehow, though I couldn't see how that was possible. The fences were intact. Still, we let it go. Strange, but not alarming. A week later, it happened again. Another sheep, gone. This time it was different. We found her. She was lying in the middle of the field, stiff and cold. But it wasn't the fact that she died that got to me. It was how. Her eyes and tongue were gone. Clean, no blood, no mess, like someone or something had surgically removed them. I called the vet, hoping for an explanation. He was as baffled as we were. "Predator," he said at first, but he didn't sound convinced. When I pointed out the lack of wounds or tracks, he went quiet. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted. We reported it to the police. They came, took pictures, asked questions. But there wasn't much they could do. It's a farm. Animals die. But this was different. Over the next few weeks, more animals went missing. Chickens, a calf, even a barn cat. Some we never found. Others turned up dead, always the same way, eyes and tongues gone, no sign of struggle. The kids started having nightmares. My youngest, Sophia, would wake up screaming, saying there were lights in her room. At first, we thought it was just her imagination. Kids get scared. But then Maria and I started hearing things too. At night, when the house was quiet, we'd hear noises, soft mechanical hums. Sometimes it sounded like something heavy moving across the roof. Other nights, it was footsteps outside, but when I'd check, there was nothing there. And the lights. One night, around 2 a.m., Maria shook me awake. "Look," she whispered, pointing out the window. Above the barn there were lights. They weren't headlights or planes, just hovering, pulsing orbs. They moved in a pattern, slow and deliberate. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they vanished. I went outside, armed with a flashlight and my old rifle. The air felt different, thicker, colder. There was a faint smell, like burnt metal. I didn't find anything that night, but I felt something. A presence. Maria wanted to leave after that. I can't blame her. But where would we go? We put everything into this farm. Besides, the police and the vet were involved now. They were investigating, though they had no answers. The worst night came about a month later. It was stormy, the wind howling around the house. The power went out, plunging everything into darkness. The kids were scared, so we lit some candles and huddled in the living room. Around midnight, the noises started again. Louder this time. The hum was deeper, vibrating through the walls. Then came the knocking, slow, deliberate, from every direction. I grabbed the rifle and shouted, "Who's there?" No answer, just more knocking. Then Sophia screamed. She pointed at the window, her little face pale with terror. When I looked, I saw them, shapes. Tall, thin figures standing just beyond the fence line. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The next morning, the police came again. They found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anyone being there. I told them about the lights, the noises, the figures. They exchanged looks, the kind that said, "This guy's losing it." The vet stopped coming after a while, said there wasn't much more he could do. The police, too. The case went cold, but the fear never left. It's still happening. Not as often, but enough. The animals are terrified. They won't go near certain parts of the farm. The lights still come, usually around 3 a.m., always in the same pattern. Maria and I sleep with the rifle by the bed now. The kids are restless and jumpy. Sophia still talks about the lights, says they visit her room at night. We've thought about leaving, selling the farm, starting fresh somewhere else. But where do you go when the unknown follows you? I know what you're thinking, that we're imagining things, that it's just stress or coincidence. I wish that were true. I wish there was a logical explanation, but there isn't. Whatever's happening here, it's real, and it's not done with us yet. Thanks for watching. Good nightmares and stay scared.